On today's RAG Masters, an epic battle for you. In this corner, RAG, or Retrieval-Augmented Generation. In this corner, CAG, or Cache-Augmented Generation. When they battle, who will win? Or do they join hands in beautiful harmony? We're going to show you what we're talking about on today's RAG Masters. Stick around. I'm Neil.
And I'm Daniel.
And this is another episode of RAG Masters, the world's only show about Retrieval-Augmented Generation. And I am so excited that I'm talking like an announcer from a wrestling match. Why? Why, Daniel? Why? Because today it's RAG and CAG, and they're going to fight it out. And I know a lot about RAG, and I know almost nothing about CAG. And that's where you're going to come in, because you've read the research papers. And this is really important to get a little serious for a second. I think most people actually completely misunderstand actually what CAG is. I've heard a lot of people come to us and say, hey, is CAG a replacement for RAG? Can I get rid of this kind of complicated pipeline, which is RAG, and talk a lot about how to build them, and they are complicated. Can I just dump all that and instead dump my giant pile of documents straight into a language model, especially one with a large context window that might be able to contain thousands of pages, not millions, but thousands? Can I just dump documents into a language model with a large context window and kind of my RAG problems go away? Everything's perfect and I don't have to worry about RAG and I have better answers and maybe it's cheaper and maybe a million other things. But what you found out when researching this is actually people don't quite understand actually what CAG is and how it works. And I want you to walk us through it today. Take us into the basics. What is RAG actually? What is CAG? And what are they actually good for? And maybe we'll figure out if there's a way for them to work in harmony instead of epic battle mode. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm super stoked. I love these sort of data science-y topics. Let's pull up the slides. I'm stoked to get into it. So
let's do it.
Let's start simple. This is Retrieval-Augmented Generation. Most of you probably know. I'll go through it really briefly. You have a question, right? That's the question that's in red right now. And then you have some knowledge base. You have a bunch of documents. And usually these documents are broken up into little chunks and they're indexed in a vector database or something like that. Then what you do is you retrieve the chunks of documents that are relevant to your question. You construct an augmented prompt, which contains your question and the context retrieved from your documents as chunks. And then you pass that augmented prompt to a language model for generation. That way the language model can look at the information from your document and your question to generate an answer. That's RAG in a nutshell, the most basic, kind of approach.
And the upside is you can ask questions about your private set of documents instead of about whatever the language model was trained on by eating the public web. And now you can bring in your private documents into a large language model application, and you even keep the costs of using that language model down because you're not trying to dump massive piles of documents in that model. You just start with little chunks, as you say, and it keeps it really efficient. And makes it possible to work with private documents. But it ain't perfect. It's complex. There's multiple steps. Things can go wrong in every step. So people started thinking, wait a second, what about something else, which might be CAG?
Exactly. So you mentioned it before. A lot of people are thinking of CAG as a drop-in replacement for RAG. In my estimation, it really doesn't concern the entire RAG pipeline. CAG really concerns a very specific subcomponent of the RAG pipeline.
Okay.
So in RAG, you do all this retrieval stuff, whatever, and then you get documents. You get the relevant documents, the relevant chunks of documents, and you feed that as text along with your query into the language model. Then it generates an answer.
So there's a search step. Someone asks a question, you have to search your documents, find chunks of documents that are useful, and you send them in the context of the language model.
Exactly. And that's the basic RAG pipeline. So you do all that stuff, then you inject your context in your query via an augmented prompt to the language model. This is how RAG works.
Yeah. The important step here, actually, I think that a lot of people don't even understand, devs do, but when someone asks a question in RAG, you don't actually ask that question to the language model directly. You insert another step. You say, wait a second, I'm going to actually, instead of asking that question of a language model, because the language model doesn't know the answer, I'm going to do a search that looks like that question, find some documents, and then send the question, the answer blocks to the language model, and then let it answer the question. So you got this middle step. Now, CAG, I think maybe you can tell me is the end of that pipeline and changes that sequence a bit.
Yeah. So regardless of how you get your context, CAG changes the way you feed context into a language model.
Okay.
That is the big difference between RAG and CAG. So for RAG, you feed the textual context straight into the language model and get an answer. With CAG,
every time you ask a question at inference time or at runtime, if you're from, as my daughter says, you're from the 1900s, Dad, you would say runtime in the day. You have to, every time you ask a question, you have to feed it some context.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And you feed it as text in the very beginning. In CAG, you still feed it context. You still have to, get some information somehow. And you still have to have context. And then you feed it to the language model, except instead of giving it the context in the query, you just give it the context. You just give it documents that are relevant to your question. And then the language model, by feeding the context into the language model, and I'll get into this a little bit, but the language model has to think about the context. And I'll talk about what thinking is in a second. But from a high level perspective, you feed just the context through. The language model thinks about the context. And then what we do is we save not the context, but the way the language model thought about the context, the way the language model interpreted the context and understand the context. We save that. And that's what the cache is. So we save how the language model thought about the context. Then when we ask questions about that document, instead of feeding the document directly in, we can feed the way the language model thought about the document along with the question.
Let's roll this back just a second. Basically, in the CAG scenario, before anyone even asks a question, you take your pile of documents and you load them into the language model, into the context window of the language model, and you ask the language model to process these documents in some way. And the language model is creating a kind of AI representation of these documents, which gives it some level of understanding of what these documents are about.
Exactly.
And that its understanding of these documents, you get into what that means in a second with your 52 bars on that slide, is what it actually stores. So it doesn't actually store your PDFs per se. It's storing its understanding of those PDFs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And it sits there. It sits in a cache.
Yes. And that's what the cache is in Cache-Augmented Generation.
And so when a user asks a question, if the answer is contained in this cached representation of your documents, the language model doesn't, in this pipeline, we don't have to go out and search your documents, which are external to the language model, because some representation of your documents is now sitting in the cache of the language model.
Yes.
Okay. Now that even without knowing exactly how the AI model makes this representation of your documents, that starts to sound like it has some advantages, like maybe it's faster because things in cache are, you've skipped a step. We're not doing a search and a re-rank and sending things to a language model. It's all sitting in a cache, which presumably is either local memory or local hard drive storage to that model. So it's much closer and fewer steps. So maybe it's faster. Is it better? If I throw in 10,000 pages, does the model really understand those 10,000 pages, or does it start to miss things or misrepresent things? Or is it better? Or is it the opposite? Because as a complete vision, I avoid the problem of it maybe searching for the wrong things.
So yeah, you're totally right. Right. Like if you basically save the way the language model thought about a big document, instead of passing that document through the language model every time, if you can save the way the language model thought about the document, then you just have to recompute how it's answering a question. You don't have to recompute the whole context every time you go to answer a question. That's the core fundamental benefit of CAG over, a more traditional RAG approach where you literally give it the textual document every time you answer a question.
So we know it's going to be faster, but is it better? Does it have a better understanding of this giant pile of information, or does it start to miss things or forget things or misconstrue things, especially stuff in the middle of the context window? Is it higher quality or low? We know it's faster. Is it better or worse?
Unfortunately, now we get to the it depends. So
okay.
Yeah, so some people will say long context window better. RAG is you see it online. RAG is dead. Like I've heard that. I've heard people saying that for years. It hasn't died. And the reason they think it's a RAG killer is because if you can fit all your documents in the context window of a language model, then like why would you need to retrieve stuff? And that's a great point. If you're doing stuff like summarization, right, where you have a really big document and then you want to summarize it, it might be useful to literally give the language model the entire document so that the language model can then summarize it. If you're doing something like RAG, RAG might not retrieve certain subcomponents of the document. It might inhibit the RAG system's ability to do summarization. But it's not universally better. Long context windows can be problematic. Information can be lost. There can be lossy sort of certain parts of the context can be kind of less attended to than other parts. Certain information might be skipped over. It seems like for many large context window models, the more context you give it up to a certain point, you can start to see some degradations and some confusion in terms of performance. Now, of course, RAG also isn't perfect. Retrieval is not always 100% accurate. You might miss stuff in the retrieval process. So, like, moving one step away from CAG for a second, just this question of long context versus RAG, it really kind of depends on the documents you're dealing with. How many documents do you have?
Okay.
How big are they? And then what types of questions are you asking?
So one detail I want people to understand, which surprised me when you told me about this paper, is that they use the word long context here. But I think when most devs today think about, even consumers think about long context, they're enamored by, they're excited by the announcements from Google and Llama, Meta most recently. Google says, hey, I've got a 2 million token context window on my latest models. I'm merging Meta and Llama into one new Meta has said, I think on their Llama 4.1, we've got a 10 million token context window. But this paper is talking about, like, what you said, 30,000 tokens or maybe even less? Or when it thinks long, it's thinking something pretty small.
Yeah, like the whole idea. So I'm mixing two papers. This paper right now is an analysis of long context RAG. So I did some research in terms of how performant is RAG really in longer contexts. So the CAG paper kind of has this fundamental presupposition that long context is better than traditional RAG systems. That isn't always the case.
It didn't really prove it, though. It sort of almost assumed it, right?
I mean, it did some it did some analysis of traditional RAG systems, and it did see some performance difference. There are many questions and many applications where long context is better than RAG. And again, long context is kind of relative.
I want to get in the size, though. I just want to be clear. Maybe not the paper, but the other paper you're reading that this conversation is partially based on. When they said long, how many tokens were they talking?
They're talking maybe 32,000, 64,000, a couple 100,000. It depends on the data set, but they're talking, you're a developer and you have a database of logs for a particular application, or you are maybe a supervisor in a grocery store and you have
No, I get it. It can fit in that window. I just want to clarify for people that the research papers right now, or at least the ones that we've read so far, are just talking about just a different order of magnitude of how big a context window is. In fact, what surprised me is they're talking about context windows that are often associated with RAG, because they're kind of small is what they're talking about. Like when you have a $30,000 token, 64,000 token window, even 128,000 token window, you're typically talking about a scenario where you need RAG to downsample the document set that goes into the context.
Yes.
But so I think there's a little disconnect maybe in the marketplace, because what people's dreams are at the moment, what people have talked to me about is, oh, I just heard I can do a 2 million token window with Gemini. 2 million tokens, I think is, I think between 15 and 30,000 pages, which could be relevant for a small business. I think when you talk about banks, hospitals, like our kind of customers have millions of pages, so this is not really a conversation for them. But when you talk about medium-sized business, Yeah, you could build an application with 30,000 pages in it. You can imagine if that works well, that could simplify your life. But that's not really what this research is about. It's about something much smaller. Is there anything, there's a disconnect in people's minds, but is there any research that might be hinting at what you could do with the 2 million context window?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think to kind of attack it obliquely, the term long context window to me is the language model's context window is longer than older models. When researchers say this is a long context window language model, they're saying we have a longer context than older language models. When businesses say I have a lot of data, they're not doing it relative to older models. They have hundreds of thousands, millions of pages of complex PDFs, right? So when a researcher says, why not just use a long context model? A long context model might have a very small context relative to many business applications. I think that's what you're saying, and I completely agree with that.
All right. So yeah, let's let's skip ahead. What are some of the issues of CAG?
Yeah. To me, there's really two. There's really two fundamental potential issues in CAG.
Okay.
One is that even if your data can fit within the context window of the model, it's not going to be perfectly infallible. There might be some questions and some data sets which perform better when subdivided into small components and treated in a traditional RAG context, where you break it up and you retrieve specific subcomponents. Even if it does fit in the context window of the language model, it might be better to break it up. It also might not, but it might be better to break it up. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, as we just previously discussed, is your long context window might not be long enough, right? So, if you're trying to feed massive data sets through, you have this system where, it would be great if we could feed all the data through, but CAG, this cache, is based on the way the language model thought about the problem. You need to be able to fit your data into the model. So to me, CAG is a really exciting way to inject context into a language model. It's not a replacement to RAG, because if you're dealing with a very large set of documents, then you're still going to need to figure out which documents you need to do CAG with. So even if you wanted to do CAG in a large context, you might need to do some retrieval step to kind of figure out what you need to do CAG with.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. You would almost like a asynchronous pre-processing problem, or you do this in real time. You're saying, or you kind of you would do like maybe this is like a deep research function. Someone asks a question, you try to assemble, interesting piles of documents. You then take those whole documents instead of pieces of them and throw them into a cache, and then ask the model to reason on the cache.
Yes, and this is why when I talk about CAG, it's a more efficient way to leverage larger contexts. It's not a replacement to RAG. So you could do pre-processing, you could do it in post, you can do it asynchronously. It's like any other caching mechanism. Once you compute something, you can choose how to store it, you can choose how to leverage it. So it's a tool that a RAG developer can use to make things more efficient.
Well, it sounds to me like epic battle, RAG versus CAG. No winner. Actually, it sounds to me like, excuse me a second. I can't do that voice all day long. It sounds to me like they're actually kind of different. They're not really in competition.
I don't think so at all.
It's like, is my hard drive in competition with the RAM in my computer? Well, no, not really. They're both storing information. They're used at different times for different purposes in a complete application.
Yeah, and they're both used in a computer.
And so the future might be CAG, RAG. It's just getting worse. Meta, why did you have so many Meta? You have 4 businesses advertising. You must have good brand marketers. Why did you put this RAG curse on us? Why did you call it RAG? And now we have CAG. It's not getting better.
It's not. It's going to get worse.
Lag, bag, jag. I don't know. It's all coming. All right. Well, final closing thoughts for you on the epic battle 2025 RAG versus CAG. Harmony?
I think so.
Harmony, people. Harmony. Remember to like, share, subscribe, do the YouTube things you do. Great to see you on RAG Masters. We'll see you next time.